I'm Dorothy, this is Patrick on the camera. We're Toronto Master Gardeners. I planted about 20 daffodil bulbs a few years ago. This year there were 54 blooms on this clump. So I want to dig it up so that I can move some of the bulbs elsewhere in the garden. After bulbs finish flowering, take off the spent flower head so that the strength goes back down into the bulb and doesn't go into making seed. That way you'll get good blooms the following year. I need to be really careful digging around these bulbs. I know they're at the right depth because they flower so well, so they've been planted at least 2 to 3 times the depth of the actual size of the bulb. So I want to be careful I don't splice through bulbs when I dig in here. I have gone deep enough, and here are the first clump of bulbs. You can see here that the original bulbs have divided and created new bulbs. That's what these little small ones hanging off. I'm going to put them in the basket so that I can continue digging out. Sometimes when bulbs don't flower, it's because daffodils, it's because they're in too much shade or they haven't been planted deep enough and there's no flower on the bulb and they come up blind. I'm just going to continue to dig this clump out and I'll replant them later. Spring flowering bulbs should be planted in the fall, in the autumn, just before winter, but I'm going to have to plant these later this week because I have nowhere to store them. This is a well-drained bed. The problem with bulbs surviving from one year to the next in our climate is that they get wet in the summer. A lot of times from irrigation systems, but there's no such irrigation system here, and it's a well-drained bed, so these bulbs have survived very well for a number of years, so I think planting them now shouldn't be a problem. After flowering, don't cut down the leaves, don't tie them up in knots. You don't want to break the leaf because the strength from the leaf goes back into the bulb. Only once the leaves have turned brown and when you shake them do they come away, can you remove bulb leaves. I've decided to leave about a quarter of the clump because they've not been disturbed. I don't really need to take this lot out. It was in a lovely location. When they flower, they're an early spring daffodil. When they flower, neither the echinops, the globe thistle, or the tall prairie sunflower has shown any sign of growth yet. So they're not crowded when they come up. And to allow these leaves to die back, both these plants are going to hide the dying back browning leaves. From the bulbs that I dug out, I've managed to get 5 good sized clumps out of them, and I'm going to plant 2 here beside the existing clump that I left in, so that I've got a nice grouping of 3 here and another 3 will go further over. When I mentioned that the bulbs had divided, that means that they've multiplied in number. They've created offsets when they were in the ground in previous years. When you dig up clumps in order to divide them and plant elsewhere, go through the bulbs and make sure that you discard any that are mushy and soft or are damaged. Throw these out. Planting now is just the same as I would plant in fall. I put in some bone meal into the hole, place the bulbs, and so that they're not touching. And the reason you do that is if one of them is diseased or mushy or rotten, although I've checked them, or it gets like that, they're not going to pass that disease on to the other bulbs. Also, plant to 2 to 3 times the depth. The height of the bulb, so that if the bulb is 2 inches, you would dig your hole 6 inches deep, which is 15 centimeters, and that way you ensure that the bulb is going to flower. If they're too shallow in the planting, you're likely not going to get flowers from them. I'm going to put some soil in and then water, and in fact after flowering you should fertilise with a bit of bone meal and water the bulbs in spring once they finish flowering, and do it again in the fall before going into winter. I'll finish planting them. Our spring flowering bulbs a lot of them come from the Middle East. Daffodils apparently come from southern Europe, and in fact were taken by the Romans to Britain. We get most of our bulbs now from Holland, because Holland has perfected the breeding of bulbs. In our summers, you want to have the same kind of conditions that bulbs have when they grow naturally, which is drought conditions. So we don't want a lot of water or a lot of rain on these. This is a really steep sloped bed, so it's really well drained, and the bulbs do really well here. I've chosen these spots for the additional groups of bulbs to give a really good impact when they're flowering, but also once they have finished flowering, they're now hidden by the perennials growing in front.